Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Claire Ramjan, and I am a PhD researcher at the University of Stirling, and I am absolutely delighted to welcome you to the second ECSA Citizen Science and Learning online event, which is really just an opportunity to enable citizen science researchers and the wider community to share their research and share the work that they're doing. So I'm delighted to have you guys all here today. The series of webinars that this is part of was initiated by members of the ECSA Working Group on Learning and Education in Citizen Science and the Citizen Science Cost Action Working Group 2, which looked at developing synergies with education alongside citizen science. So we're really delighted to welcome our speakers today, who are going to talk a wee bit about the research that they've been doing that relates to citizen science and education, conservation and biodiversity, and really look forward to your questions and discussion about these talks. There are a couple of kind of organisational things to let you know. So you will be muted on the way in. Please stay muted for the presentation part of the seminar today. Just it makes it easier for everybody to make sure that they can hear everything that's going on. The seminar is being recorded. However, we'll record the presentation element of it, but not the discussion. So once the presentations have finished, we'll stop that so that people then can get involved in the discussion a little bit more freely. What we will do, however, afterwards is a copy of the video will be up on the ECSA YouTube channel, so you can watch again if there's any bits that you want to kind of catch up on, or to recommend it to your networks. But we will also then pull the discussion ideas together into a blog post, and that will also be published shortly afterwards as well. So the kind of aspects of discussion will be there for others to read as well. If you, there is a transcript available, a live transcript available of the recordings. So if you are interested in that, it's not a subtitle as such, it's an automatic transcript, but if you just click on the live transcript button at the bottom, you will be able to enable that feature. And so, without further ado, I'll introduce our first speaker. So we have two sets of speakers this afternoon. So firstly, Andy Ruck is going to present some of the findings from his recent PhD project. Now I'll let Andy introduce that a little bit more detail, but it's focused very much on the embedding citizen science within a conservation project and the challenges of making that project both good science and good education, and just kind of seeing those unplanned things that happen during citizen science projects. So I'll hand over to Andy to start now.
Thank you very much, Claire, and I will just share my screen here. Great. Okay, so full screen, everyone can see that, yeah? Good. Great. So again, thanks very much, Claire, for introducing me and to the European Citizen Science Association for the invitation to present on this afternoon. My name is Andy. I may have met some of you before. I now work at the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences, or SLU, on a very different but still citizen science related project. And this is about my PhD research, which I finished a couple of years ago now at the University of Stirling in Scotland. And it was linked closely through funding and everything to this project, which is called Pollination, which is what I'm going to talk about today. It's been a while actually since I've talked about especially the citizen science element of this project. So it's really good to go over it again. I think it still stands as a really good example of a citizen science project that is embedded within a wider conservation project. So it's kind of action oriented, and that is largely what I'm going to talk about today. So pollination this was the aim of it, to create a network of knowledgeable and enthused young conservationists across the UK who turn their school grounds into diverse habitats full of pollinating insects and wildlife. So it goes back to 2014. That was when the project proposal was written. Most of the work in schools took place between 2016 and 2018, and my PhD research around that time as well. It's a very ambitious project. It involved 260 schools, both primary and secondary, across the UK. It was run mostly by a charity called Learning Through Landscapes, who are all about promoting outdoor learning in formal education contexts. But there was also input from all of these other organisations as well: Bumblebee Conservation Trust, Butterfly Conservation, Opal, which was Open Air Laboratories, who were part of in charge of the citizen science element of it, and University of Stirling were there in a evaluative capacity, and we linked my PhD research to that. But there was also a summative evaluation of the project as a whole for a non-academic audience that I did as part of this as well. I think crucially, conservation was probably the main aspect of this project. So the idea was that young people would turn their school grounds or areas of their school grounds into habitats that were good for pollinating insects. So that included planting areas of flowers, wildflower meadows, planting fruit trees, leaving areas that would normally be mown, and building insect hotels, all these kind of small conservation tasks that can be done in school grounds. There were usually visits from members of conservation staff from the charity Learning Through Landscapes, who would then, the idea was that they would run the initial activities with pupils and with teachers, and then teachers and the pupils themselves would decide upon the actions to be taken, and then they would take the project forward from there. So today, I'm going to talk about embedding citizen science into a conservation project, and the importance of unplanned moments within that, and the importance of having a focus that goes beyond a narrow focus on scientific data collection, and hopefully that was demonstrated by this project. So the citizen science element of it was this pollination survey. It took place right at the start of the project and at the end, and I think optionally, some schools did this and some didn't, in the middle of the project. And the idea was to do a bit of a survey of the school grounds. Part of it was doing a survey of the whole school grounds, to a sort of inventory really of what was there in terms of biodiversity and in terms of pollinator-friendly habitats. And that, going through a tick list to say what kind of habitats were there and what existed, and so on. And there was this activity where pupils would choose several areas of 1 meter squared with a quadrat, and count the number of pollinators that came to that area. So that was the citizen science element of it. And the kind of areas, just to give you an idea of the kind of areas they were monitoring, this was perhaps a typical one in the school grounds. They sort of reclaimed this area, fenced it off with some raised beds there on the left, some fruit trees, a wild area along the side. They even had some beehives in this one, actually. So this was the kind of area that was constructed especially for the pollination project. And to contrast that with areas like this, this was in one of the schools. To be fair, just behind where this photo was taken, there was a bit of a wildflower meadow and a kind of nicer area for pollinators. But there were other schools that were completely like this in their school grounds, and the actions that they took for pollinators were limited to planting boxes with pollinator-friendly flowers in them, which of course would have made a big difference. So that's the kind of range of schools that we're talking about. Conservation activities such as these, planting fruit trees, these were kind of typical within the project. There were also activities varied hugely across schools. So there was a visit in one school by a local graffiti artist who had the young people doing various bits of artwork relating to pollinators. I didn't actually see this happen, so I don't know if that was the young people themselves that did that, or it's quite impressive if so. So there was that, and there was a visit from a beekeeper in this school, for example. So that was another aspect of the project, that teachers and young people were free to think what kind of experts they would like to get involved and come in and talk to them about anything relating to pollinators. So yeah, so this I'm going to talk about these points, these key points about the project with reference to a few papers. These are not my own, these ones. There's one, Place Responsive Pedagogy, was one back in 2013 by my supervisor, it was Greg Mannion at Stirling University, and there's this one by Ballard et al., which are the most important for making this point here, and that is that is the importance of seeing the changes in school grounds as a result or following citizen science activities. So the citizen science element of pollination happened, as I say, right at the start of the project, and young people would survey their school grounds and invariably find that it was not a very good habitat for pollinators, right? So the next step, and this is where I try to think of what that project would have been like if that had been the only element of it, if there hadn't been any kind of follow on from that. But that was always, so young people did this survey at the start, and then afterwards the emphasis was on taking the necessary steps to improve the school grounds biodiversity wise, or in terms of how friendly they were to pollinators. And they would agree on actions to be taken with staff from Learning Through Landscapes, so on. And I think there was a certain amount within, there was a certain amount of steering them towards particular actions through recommendations and so on. But yeah, there was absolutely this building upon that citizen science element to make those changes. And then to refer back to that Mannion article, he talks about seeing the place respond. So this is a really important element of these projects, I think, was that young people would not only do the survey and then take action, but they would do another survey at the end and they would see the changes that had occurred in the school grounds in terms of number of pollinators visiting those areas and number of different types of flowers, for example. And I could see just from the project that that was a really important thing. I haven't written any papers on that or anything, and I also did not, unfortunately, get to see them do the surveys after the project. I'm just basing that on a few visits later in the academic year in which I did most of the field work for that project, where young people were noticing pollinators more and pointing out the changes that they'd made to school grounds, things that they'd planted in the autumn, for example, that were now coming up in spring and early summer. And so I can imagine from that doing the survey at the end of it would have been a powerful experience. And that does relate to these other papers as well. Ballard et al. In that paper, they talk about, I believe that paper, it's been a while since I've read it, but I believe it was about asking young people what was relevant to them about participation in citizen science, and much of that led to what they called environmental science agency. And part of that was participation in some kind of action relating to conservation, or that kind of acted upon what they were doing, or the data that they collected through citizen science. So that's it, seeing the place respond, and action-oriented citizen science is also a whole area of literature as well that has been written about a little bit. So that was something that I felt was important from that pollination project. Also, so these two articles that I have had published recently, both in environmental education research. Now, both of them have conservation in the title rather than citizen science. I did this because conservation was the more major part of pollination, which took up more of the project than the citizen science element did. Also because I thought it was a more obvious gap. I felt that there really hadn't been much written about conservation activities. But these arguments, I feel, could just as easily be made about citizen science. And in this paper, this was based on the focus groups that I did as part of this PhD research, where young people were, and these, it's important to say that these were based on participant observations, so things that I had observed about the project, through, I think, around 25 sessions by that point of going into school, various different participating schools and participating in the activities myself with the pupils. And I had come up with this set of flashcards. I would ask young people openly first, but then would present this set of flashcards for them to select from important elements of the project and to comment on those, to discuss them. And from that, it was this experts, insects and informality, meaning basically the importance of working with experts from outside of school, in this case, both the staff from Learning Through Landscapes and also other experts that they had in. There was, for example, a woodworking expert who they built wooden planters with to plant flowers in. There was also other staff from other conservation charities who came into schools to talk to them. There was the beekeeper and the graffiti artist that I mentioned just there. So this was one of the factors that was chosen a lot by young people in this, as well as encounters with other species, which was something that was probably bound to happen with this. That experts from outside of school, I think, really resonates with some findings from previous papers where they've talked about realness of the citizen science experience for young people, which does not only mean that it is real science and that it contributes to scientific papers and so on, but can also mean contact with the scientists themselves in order to, sort of broaden horizons, I suppose, and get young people thinking about other aspects of the community outside of school, I suppose, and other areas. So that realness was an important thing there. Encounters with other species and also a relaxed atmosphere was another of these flashcards, and is important for the next point that I'm going to make, which is in this other paper. This was based more on the participant observation side of things in the project. Now, I took as a starting point this criticism of what is labeled a stewardship perspective. So the idea of positioning young people as the agents of change, or as humans, really, as the ones who act upon landscapes and who have the power to alter landscapes. And some proponents of post-human pedagogies are a little critical of this way of positioning young people, and it makes conservation activities and possibly citizen science as well somewhat problematic from that perspective. But I found in this research that it's actually not as simple as the simple reproduction of this stewardship perspective of young people, of reinforcing this separation between humans and nature and humans as acting upon it. It is, in fact, there were in fact many moments of unplanned encounters with other species and of spontaneous learning moments that occurred through those visiting experts and teachers themselves as well, and young people themselves even sharing bits of knowledge that they had in response to unplanned moments such as encounters with other species. And these things can all happen in the space of a citizen science project, alongside the kind of official task that that frames the session, and that's really the main purpose of this, the main argument of this paper here. I have some examples from that in that paper, but they include basically, I summarize them as demonstrating excitement, empathy, and fascination on the part of young people. So they included things like finding a ladybird here and being just the excitement of unexpectedly coming across this species. And I think in this picture, I think a load of other young people were crowded around to look at it and look at what it was doing, and commenting that they'd never noticed them in the school grounds before, and these kinds of things. And I think, so that's the important message, really, that this was not restricted to the simple reproduction of a stewardship perspective. There was all this fascination, empathy, excitement going on and opportunities for the project to go off in places that were not only that scientific learning. So I think, to summarize the signposts for practice that I would put across from that project, importance of data collection combined with action, so acting upon the data collected through conservation activities, through the embedding of a citizen science project within a wider conservation initiative, and the importance of visiting experts and encounters with other species. There's also an area of literature community curriculum making here that this really closely links to. And I would say it's important to have citizen science as a task to frame a session, but to keep not too narrow a focus on the scientific learning. I've read elsewhere recently that there's an argument that the projects that very much focus on the science of something can lead to very clear learning outcomes, but that they're often quite narrow. And if you leave a session, keep a session open to other outcomes as well, which could just be a case of just leaving more time to do these activities and not rushing to get the data collected, and keeping it open to these more than human elements, bringing as many extra elements in, such as the visiting experts from outside of school, is a way that can lead to, that can branch off and lead to a much wider array of learning outcomes for young people. There were, of course, challenges with this pollination project, which I can talk about more later if conversation goes that way, but basically there were time, teachers not having enough time to fit this project in to the curriculum was a key challenge of the project. And this perception also that these activities were suited to small groups of young people, and that would result often in the project actually being carried out in a kind of extracurricular capacity. So it was children with additional support needs sometimes, so ones who were perhaps not engaging well with mainstream classes, or in secondary schools even alternative programs for young people who were not going to be taking the regular exams. And that was often the reason, in fact, for the relaxed atmosphere that there was within the project, and the chances for young people to ask these spontaneous questions and for the project to kind of go off script in places. But the key thing is that it can be done with whole classes, and indeed was by some schools within the project. And from speaking to facilitators from Learning Through Landscapes, what we decided was that I think more regular support for the teachers who were involved was needed, because there were some schools where just one freelance facilitator was employed for looking after just a small number of schools, and had a lot of flexibility to go into those schools whenever required and offer more extensive support to teachers. So for getting these things embedded into curricula, that more support than was actually given to most schools was a really important thing. And that, we said in the evaluation, I think starting off with 260 schools was very ambitious, but possibly there could have been clearer outcomes, clearer progress towards getting these things embedded in curricula if fewer schools had been worked with more often. I mean, of course, working with the same number of schools more often would have been great, but there were not the resources for that. So either, yeah, more resources or a more intensive focus on a smaller number of schools. Now, of course, the other challenge was the trade-off between good data and educational experience. Now, with this project, I should say I'm not a natural scientist, so I am probably unqualified to comment on this. I did feel from seeing the citizen science activities that it was not going to lead to any very substantially good data, although I think that was the idea at the start. As far as I know, it hasn't. There have not been any actual scientific papers published off the back of this. It was often, I felt it was very open to inaccuracies, this project. Young people were not given much in the way of prior training or learning as to how to identify different flowers, pollinators, and so on. They just went out with a kind of ID guide and were expected to identify the pollinators that came into that 1 meter square, for example. And that was probably done successfully in many cases, but also the idea of just observing for 2 minutes in one space, I felt you could have extended that more or done it in slightly more times than just once anyway. So I felt that was a bit of a shortcoming of the project perhaps, but then it was a very good educational experience, and there is that if you'd asked young people to sit there and count pollinators for very much longer, then I guess it probably would have been open to even more inaccuracies and so on. So that's something I will just leave there, because I'm not not particularly qualified to talk about that. And I think we know that already, and we've seen that through various literature and so on, that there is always this trade-off between good data and educational experience. You know, are you looking at this as primarily something to engage new audiences in science and in conservation or whatever, or are you really looking to gather extensive amounts of good quality data? And in this case, I mean, absolutely the main purpose from the start was on the educational experience. And to go back to the first slide there, to create a network of knowledgeable and enthused young conservationists. And I think absolutely that activity helped with that. But as I said, that was really important that that citizen science element was embedded within this wider conservation project. And that, I think, is they were a couple of extra slides there, but that was the main argument of this, really, that importance of embedding within a conservation project, and that importance of unplanned events and so on within a citizen science project. So I will hand over to the next speaker, I guess.
Thank you, Andy. That was absolutely fascinating. I know a little bit of the background of some of those projects, but it's so interesting to hear the whole thing and presented in such a clear way. As I said earlier on, we're going to do questions all together at the end. So if people have made a wee note of things that they're wondering about, pop them into the chat, and then we'll pull them all together, and then we'll bring everything together once the second speakers have carried out their particular part. So that just leads me on to handing over to Julia and Lucy. They are going to share a little bit of the insights from their recently completed Learn Sit Sci project, which focuses on the Natural History Museum and the experience of BioBlitzes. So I'll hand over to you guys just now.
Hi, I'm having an interesting problem, but give me a second, I'm going to solve this. Part of my screen is not visible, so that's new. There we go. Okay, so we wanted to share insights from the project Learn Sit Sci. And Lucy and I are going to talk about very different things. So I'm going to report on the first outcome of our research efforts, the first thing that we looked at and focused on, and the first thing that we got published from our field-based side of the project. And Lucy is going to present basically the lessons learned and what can practitioners maybe learn from our experiences in this project. So you get to see different aspects of the same project today. Yeah, the paper that we published is called Step by Step Towards Citizen Science, Deconstructing Youth Participation in BioBlitzes. And as you can see, it's a huge project with a lot of people involved. Yeah, and since working at the Natural History, I actually now moved and I'm based in Germany again. So lots of things have changed since we worked on this study. When you look at definitions of citizen science, you always have this aspect of authentic scientific research that sets citizen science apart from other educational experiences or public engagement experiences. But then studies also show that when you look at project descriptions, 92% of the projects, that is for the SciStarter project a couple of years back, actually want to achieve educational goals. So education is a huge part of many citizen science projects. And a lot of learning outcomes have been studied, and there are a couple of reviews that I'm referencing here, if you're interested in that. Aspects like very specific project-related content knowledge, but also broader aspects like nature of science, changes in attitudes of interest in, and skills development, but also aspects like scientific citizenship. And a concept that we work with in Learn Cit Sci is environmental science agency. So there's more and more research being done and available, but what we find is that many studies focus on a specific project or on adults or on formal education settings. And that's where Learn Cit Sci comes in. We're looking at young people and their participation and learning outcomes in informal science settings. And as you can see here, there's this whole logic model applied to participatory research. And before we can actually talk about the outcomes, there are a couple of other things involved, like the whole design of the program, but also the actual delivery and the experience, the participation of people who attend or engage in citizen science. So that was the first focus of our work. Yeah, so I already mentioned informal science education. We are actually looking at natural history museum-led citizen science programs. So programs at the California Academy of Sciences, the Natural History Museum in London, and the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles County. And all three museums offer different types of programs that are run mainly online, field-based events, one-off programs, they're called BioBlitzes in our case, and field-based ongoing programs where people take part multiple times and over a longer period of time. We were actually interested in to find out what activities young people really engage in when they participate in the BioBlitz. So I'm focusing on the field-based events, the one-off events that museums run. And to find out what activities young people engage in, we did field observations. Just if some of you don't know what a BioBlitz is, BioBlitzes are events where experts and members of the public work together to generate a biodiversity inventory of a particular location over a specific period of time. So usually, traditionally, they used to last 24 hours, but a format called mini BioBlitz has become quite popular. So those are shorter events, and all the museum BioBlitzes that we observed, or most of them, actually are mini BioBlitzes. And to get this inventory, you need to generate biological records of all the different types of organisms that were found. So you need to document who found what, when, and where. These are the elements of a biological record. And then those records can be stored to local databases, national or international databases. So this data actually becomes available for scientific research or monitoring purposes for land managers and scientists. So that's the goal why people are actually doing BioBlitzes. And then just to put it into the citizen science typology, BioBlitzes are contributory projects. So citizens' involvement is about collecting data, initial analysis here that would kind of be the initial identification of organisms. We were able to observe 15 of those BioBlitz events across all the 3 museums, and to observe 81 focal youth between the age of 5 and 19. And our observation intervals were about 20 minutes. Some were longer, some were shorter, depended on the activity and the young people. what we found is that BioBlitzes offer a whole bouquet of different experiences for our young people. So we had kind of moments and experiences that we observed that are similar to science and environmental education. So aspects of young people listening to an expert, being taught what species are named or where to find them, where they live, some kind of sorting experiment, sorting game, grouping specimen into taxonomical groups. Yeah, something you would see in environmental education settings. One of my favorite moments in these observations, on these field notes, was when a young girl yelled, "Don't step on the volcanoes," and I was irritated. I was like, what's going on? But she was actually expressing environmental stewardship, because the scientists, museum experts in the field actually had told the participants to be very careful with the habitat and to return everything the way they found it and not to destroy anything. And so she was just warning other participants not to step on the barnacles and yeah, not to destroy them. So she was really expressing environmental stewardship. Then we also have elements of public engagement with science. So this interacting with professional scientists in the field, working together with them, collaborating, using the same authentic tools, the same practices. That is something that we often see in public engagement programs. But we also observed young people really recording data for science with recording sheets in a traditional way, or with using iNaturalist, using the machine learning aspect, for example, to find out what they found and then submit the data to a database. So that's the citizen aspect for our type of citizen science programs that we also observed. So if we zoom in more into the citizen science aspect, then we can see that there are a couple of steps involved, types of participation to actually get to this biological record. So you can imagine you are in a natural habitat, you explore, you turn around some logs, you look at the vegetation, for example. So you're exploring the habitat to find different species, different organisms. You observe them, you try to find out what they are, what species you found by using ID guides or the machine learning aspect in iNaturalist, for example, or other types of apps. Then you're documenting your findings, maybe as a photo, could be a drawing, could be just noting it down. And then you record the data by submitting it or creating a biological record using technology or using a sheet of paper. Both things were available at different BioBlitzes. In our study, we found that 14 of the young people that we observed did not engage in any of those aspects. The BioBlitzes are sometimes some kind of festival, some kind of bigger event. So there are also other things to do. Some just went to a puppet theater show, some went to a more lecture style part of the event, and others went to stalls to talk to scientists, but they never engaged in the actual data collection process. But 67 young people actually did participate in one or more. So often we see combinations of those aspects. But we could only observe 3 young people that took part in all of the 5 steps. And an additional 9 young people actually submitted records, submitted data to science, but might not have been the one who found the actual organism. But these 12 young people are the only one in our sample that submitted data to science, that actually took part in this citizen science specific aspect of the whole event. We also found young people who documented their findings. They took a picture or they noted down what they found, but they didn't submit that document, this artifact, to the scientist or to the database directly. So the data they actually created in some way is not accessible for any kind of scientist who's interested in them. But this kind of engaging with nature and documenting findings is something that we see in people who are engaged with natural history. So that's why we call this profile natural history. Most of our young people actually only participated in exploring, observing, and identifying organisms. Things that are quite commonly done in other environmental education programs that do not have a citizen science aspect. So as you can see, for the majority of the young people that we observed, they did not really engage with the citizen science aspect of the event. And that is something that was interesting to us, and that led us to the following conclusion. So we think that based on so very few young people engaging in the recording step, that program designers should reflect on goals for their youth participation in BioBlitz. It is completely legitimate to decide that you run events where you focus on adults for the citizen science aspect and provide some educational experience for the young people in the setting. But if you really want to engage young people in citizen science, then you should think about how you can better support young people in this recording step. And we see in other studies that this opportunity to develop data ownership and interact with data actually matters for young people's learning outcomes. And then from a research perspective, seeing that the experiences of young people are so different in the same setting, we think that we need to take the actual participation into account when we are researching citizen science learning outcomes. So here we propose to have a more fine-grained framework of what participation looks like in settings, so that you can sort your participants into different profiles and then compare the outcomes for the different profiles and see, is it the citizen science aspect that leads to certain outcomes, or is it the whole experience, for example, the whole program experience? Yeah, so you can, of course, read the paper. I'm going to share the link as well. If Lucy hasn't done it already, I'm not sure, I'm not following the chat. Follow us on Twitter to get more updates on the project. And now I'm handing off to Lucy, and she's going to tell you about this new resource for practitioners that came out of the project.
Thanks, Julia. Hopefully you can all see my screen now. So yeah, Julia and I are a bit of a double act, kind of two halves of the same presentation, really. So carrying on from what she's saying, I'm going to tell you about some and share our recommendations that we have for the citizen science practitioner community, but that are also relevant beyond that across informal science learning, both research and practice. So quickly to introduce myself, I'm the Citizen Science Manager at the Natural History Museum in London. And so I lead a whole varied program of citizen science research projects. So I'm very much on the practitioner side, not the researcher bit. And I've developed various kind of knowledge exchange and best practice guides to support other people in running citizen science projects. So there's some links there. I've been leading the UK side of this international partnership for the past, getting on for 5 years now. And actually, it's particularly nice to be talking to ECSA again today, because I was very involved in ECSA quite a few years ago, leading one of the working groups on sharing best practice. And I was vice chair for a year or so before I went on maternity leave. So it's really nice to be back and to be seeing some familiar names in the chat. So today I wanted to highlight this guide that we've just produced, Enhancing Youth Learning Through Community and Citizen Science. And this talks you through our research project, the actual structure of the research project. We share some of the learning theories that we used to guide our research, and then go through some of the recommendations and lessons learned that we have. So I'm just going to pick out a few things today, particularly to share with you, but I would encourage you to go and have a look at this guide online. We also have hard copies, so if you would prefer a hard copy, then let me know and I can send you one. So as Julia was saying, the actual way a program is designed to support both participation and learning, so people have to be participating in the activities before that you can get the learning outcomes that you're hoping for. We discovered that this framework of cultural historical activity theory is very useful from both a researcher and a practitioner perspective to map out the different elements of a learning setting that you can then examine each one in turn and think, how are you designing your program in that respect to lead to the learning outcomes that you want. So we adapted cultural historical activity theory. We added in a couple of extra concepts of location and framing. And this is a graphic from that guide that I just shared. But we find that each of these components, thinking of them as design features, has been very useful for us when we now think, how do we want to adapt our projects to enhance youth learning? We can pick each of these in turn. So framing, how is it framed? To what extent are we emphasizing the science, or is it a fun event, or is it to protect nature? Is it with a conservation angle? We can think about each of those elements. What tools are we providing for young people to take part in, and how are they supported to use them, etc. So I'd encourage you to have a look at that framework, because it's a very useful way of structuring your thinking about program design. And also the other learning framework that we used is Environmental Science Agency, which has been mentioned a little bit already today, but it has these three elements. The first one of developing content knowledge and understanding kind of norms and skills of science, which is what we often think about when we talk about learning. But also there's the sort of the second element, what we call the SA2, which is more about recognizing your own expertise, taking on roles and developing your science identity. And then there's sort of third part of ESA, which is about developing a sense of agency, that you can go and do something, whatever it is that you want to do, with these skills and knowledge that you've developed through participating in the program. So again, as a practitioner, I found that a really useful framework when I'm thinking about what kinds of outcomes do I want from my project, and so how can I design my project to achieve those? And often we design hoping that people will learn content knowledge and skills, but how do you design a project to support someone to take on roles or to develop their sense of identity or their sense of agency? So that's been a really interesting process from a practitioner point of view as well, and a really useful set of three types of learning outcomes to work from. I found it a useful framework both, as I say, for project design, but then also evaluation. So when we're looking at what does success look like, we can sort of look at those three buckets of ESA and hope to develop our participants in each of those respects. But also, whilst it's not a linear thing, you don't progress through Environmental Science Agency 1, 2, and 3 in order, but it does provide nominally a pathway to how citizen science can actually lead to stewardship behaviours or other behaviours that fits very closely with the museum's mission to create advocates for the planet. Because to be an advocate and to advocate for the planet, you need to have a sense of agency that you can do that. So it's a very interesting framework. I encourage you to go and read more about Environmental Science Agency anyway, outside of our project. So our key recommendations. So these frameworks are really useful, as I've said. Framing in particular, framing an activity as science or as environmental monitoring is really important, and also highlighting young people's role in it. And we found in our research that often the core staff who were organising a programme or an event were fully on board with that and up to speed with what the framing should be. But often then there are other facilitators at an event who maybe weren't as clear as what the framing should be. And then indeed, parents or carers or other people who come to an event or an activity with young people are also part of that framing, and how they respond to the activities and how they lead their young person through it affects those outcomes. So we've been thinking much more about how we can have more training for all of the facilitators who are at the event, and even prompts for parents at the event to help them lead their young person through it and to support that learning and open up those learning opportunities. We also found, especially in the BioBlitz context, you said like there's often other fun activities, like maybe there's face painting or craft activities or other things going on at an event. And we found that they, in fact, dilute the messaging, or they dilute young person's understanding of what the event is and the science focus. And so whilst they might make the event more fun, or they might be engaging, they're not helping us to achieve learning outcomes. Because the citizen science is getting a bit lost. And we found that citizen science programs that just have the citizen science really front and center were much more successful in achieving those kinds of learning outcomes. As Julia said, lots of young people are involved in maybe the exploring and discovering kind of part of being in nature, but relatively few participate in actually submitting the data. And that's such a important, powerful step, having that external, being answerable to an external audience in some way, sharing your data beyond what's happening at the event today. So we're focusing on much more support for young people to take part in that step. And for young people to develop, to try different roles in an activity. So for them to find where they have their own expertise or develop expertise. And so are you the one who's really good at taking a photograph for identification purposes? Or are you the one who's really good at using a particular scientific tool? It gives young people the space to recognize that they have something valuable skills and expertise to bring to a project, and that they still have those skills and expertise beyond the project to go and do other things that they want to do. Tool use in particular, we found as an important facilitator of learning, not just providing tools, because we always provide lots of scientific tools at BioBlitzes. There's sweep nets and microscopes and all sorts of different things, but more specifically training and support in how to use them, how to use them correctly, and good modeling of how to do it, and the opportunity for young people to practice and build their own competence at it. One of the programs we studied, we'd actually deliberately designed it to not require any special tools. We were thinking that would lower barriers to entry, which possibly it does, but we actually found that then that was a missed opportunity for learning, because if there were no tools to use, the young people couldn't then practice and get into using them and develop expertise. So that was an interesting one for us in terms of program design, that actually requiring people to use tools might be a good thing. And also inevitably we found that, we're assessing, are young people developing this sense of agency? And it's only really fair to measure that if you have designed your project such that you're leading them in that direction. If you're not designing for young people to develop agency, it's less likely that they're just going to develop it, the sense that they can go and do things after the project. So building in more hints and prompts of what young people might do with their skills and knowledge after the event is really important, and sort of building on partly what Andy said about not honing in too specifically on that being a science thing that they have to do or that they might do next. It could be anything. And there's a phrase, a researcher in the US called Angie Calabrese-Barton uses this phrase, STEM-empowered lives. So it's not that they have to go on and do something sciencey, but it's that those STEM skills that they have can empower them across their life to do other things that they want to do. So in a BioBlitz context, some of the things that we've been designing in is a pre-event training for all of the facilitators, so that everybody is clear on the framing and the way that we can talk about it as a scientific event. creating a really tiny prompt card for parents that just gives them a couple of pointers of how they can facilitate their young person to take part. We've created these graphics on the right of the screen there that sets out those steps Julia was talking about of how you make a biological record and share it onwards, so that people can see all the steps of the process, and encourages them to do all of the steps of the process. We actually made this as a collect a sticker thing. That was actually very distracting. We won't do the collecting a sticker again because people focus too much on getting stickers than on what we're actually trying to communicate. But setting out graphically around the event all the ways in which you can participate, the different roles that you can take on, and particularly facilitating that tool use and sharing data, sharing your records onwards that I mentioned before. So I just wanted to share a few resources then with you and highlight also in this guide, the latter chapters are more about our research process. So there's a chapter about our researcher practitioner partnerships and how that worked. And it's quite interesting for people who might replicate similar types of projects. Also how we collaborated with community-based organizations through this, and also our response to COVID-19 and the Black Lives Matter social justice movement. So there's some interesting stuff in there kind of in parallel with our research findings. So I don't expect you to do anything with that, but hopefully we'll share these slides after, and so you can follow up on some of the papers that we've published or that are coming out very soon. And then here's some links, a link to that guide that I've mentioned, but then also our project web pages. And we have a series of podcasts also on SoundCloud, where members of our team in groups of 2 or 3 are having discussions sort of for 10 minutes or so on particular topics within the research project. So that's quite a nice way to hear about our research in a different way to just sort of reading papers and reading the booklet. So I'd encourage you to go and have a listen there as well. So that's all from me. Thank you so much for your time today and for inviting me to speak. So I'll hand over now, Claire, I think, to facilitate some questions. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Lucy and Julia. That was, again, so interesting and just great to hear the kind of the bigger picture of research that I've heard little bits and pieces about over the last week. So that was brilliant. So thank you ever so much for that.